Hello, everybody. My name is Diana Lindsay. I'm the president of Sunbelt Publications, and welcome to another Sunbelt Spotlight. We're very happy that you could join us today to hear Richard Carrico, who is a very excellent speaker, talking about his book, Strangers in a Stolen Land. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the book before we start, and then we'll do some housekeeping. And the best way to tell you about this book is to read the review from the Midwest Book Review. And this will give you an idea about how important this book really is. Strangers in a Stolen Land, Indians of San Diego County, From Prehistory to the New Deal, is recommended for any Southern California history collection and for any library strong in regional Native American history. It's especially important given that comparatively few Native American titles focus on California natives versus the wealth of information available for other US regions. His original edition of this title covered San Diego County Indian history from 1850 to 1880. This expanded edition incorporates many new chapters on San Diego County history into the 1900s. A key important survey highly recommended for any comprehensive California history or Native American collection. So you can see this is a very, very special book. By the way, this is being recorded. So if you miss any part of this, or if you know of anyone that has missed this and would like to see this, this will be online on YouTube, our YouTube station, in the next couple of days, and that you can anytime download it and view it. Also, I'd like to mention that this book also has a special discount because of the presentation that we're doing. So please check our website. And if you look in the chat box, you'll be able to get the website address so you can take advantage of the discount for this book because of the presentation. By the way, the chat box, please feel free during Richard's lecture to ask any questions that you might want him to respond at the end of his presentation. So go ahead and use that. Also, I'd like to tell you that November, December is a Black Friday for Sunbelt, but it's going to last 2 months from now all the way through the end of December. We have several books available for $5 and those for $10. So please check our website or a link to find out about these books. It's important that if you want to take advantage of this sale, that you call Sunbelt or that you email Sunbelt or that you actually come to the warehouse. If you order online, you'll actually be charged the regular price. So take advantage of this Black Friday special, check out the list of books. And if you'd like to take advantage of the $5, $10 book sale through the end of December, be sure and check it out. Another thing I'd like to mention is that there will be another presentation this year to end the year on December the 16th, and it will be Mark Jorgensen talking about desert bighorn sheep. Here is his book. He's an expert on desert bighorn sheep. It's an absolutely gorgeous book. He's a fine lecturer, so be sure and put that on your calendar and reserve a space. The other one that's coming up is in January 4th, myself. I'll be talking about Marshall South and the Ghost Mountain Chronicles. If you've ever been up to Ghost Mountain and wanted to know about Marshall South and his family, be sure and sign up for that presentation, which will be on January the 4th. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Richard before I hand over the mic to him. Richard actually lives in Warner Springs, and he's a winemaker. Also, he's a lecturer in the Department of American Indian Studies at San Diego State University. In addition to more than 30 publications in professional journals. Richard is the author of Images of the American series, Ramona, published by Arcadia Publications in 2011, and the newly revised Strangers in a Stolen Land, published in 2014. He's also written a book on wine, Wine on the Lees, Well Refined, a history of wines and wineries of San Diego County. He also has authored standalone chapters in 3 academic books. So I'm pretty excited to hear about this lecture, which is going to be on Kumeyaay resistance and accommodation. So Richard, take it away.
All right, thank you. So it's good to see all of you people here. One of the interesting things I'm noticing, besides Diana Lindsay and I actually were in graduate school together. And at that time, she was working on her research on the desert, Anza Borrego Desert, and I was working on strangers in a stolen land. I didn't know that. It was a thesis at the time that then turned into a book. And just looking at the different names on here, guys, there's ex-students, there's colleagues, there's some of my Native American friends, and just a really wide group of people. And, you know, some of you, I think Kim May, for instance, is probably back in the Midwest still somewhere. So that's the beauty of the internet. So I'm going to do a PowerPoint, partially because I've got some images that I think will bring some of the story alive. And I am focusing on some of the resistance that the Kumeyaay Native American people enacted against the Spanish and then later the Mexican, and then also some accommodations, because like all cultures, the Kumeyaay people saw some advantages to going along in certain situations, maybe intermarriage, maybe some implements, whatever. So it's a balanced story that I'm going to try to give you. It's the tip of the iceberg. In fact, it might be the frost on the tip of the iceberg, because it's a story that covers hundreds of years. So I'm going to start out with talking about the past, but what I want to stress is this is not a story about the past. It's a story about the present and the future, in that the Kumeyaay are obviously, excuse me, still here on their reservations and off reservations. And so it's a continuing story, and we're going to end up at that point at the very end. So I'm going to go to share screen and do a little bit of a PowerPoint here for you. I've been told we're going to hold questions till the end. You can either do it through chat, and then that'll get moderated, or at the end we can do it however Diane and the other folks at Sunbelt want to do. So let me bring up the share screen here through the wonders of technology. All right. So as Diana mentioned, I do teach in the Department of American Indian Studies at San Diego State University. And if you're an Aztec or a former Aztec, you should be proud of the school, the university, in that we had one of the first Native American studies departments in America. And still it is one of the largest. We give both a minor and a major in American Indian studies. And quite an enrollment the last couple of years, even with COVID. And a fair amount of local Native American people coming in and taking the classes and either minoring or majoring in it, serving as teaching assistants. So it's more than just an academic program. It's part of the whole outreach and pulling Native Americans into the academic system. So I'd just like to start by saying Hauka, and there are different ways to spell this and different enunciations of it, depending on if you're Epi, Tipi, or for perhaps from northern Baja California. So Auka or Hauka is basically a hello or greetings. It's more than that. It's a welcoming into your heart of the people you're introducing yourself to. And I would acknowledge that we are in fact on Native American land here in San Diego County, from at least Carlsbad south down into Baja California, and from the ocean east out to the Colorado River. So when we talk about this being San Diego County and the city of San Diego and all of that, while that's certainly true, it's essentially unceded or unconquered, if you will, Kumeyaay land. There was never a formalized treaty that got through Congress that gave land or took land. It's still in theoretically, it's still very much Kumeyaay land, with of course the Kumeyaay people here on on the landscape. So who were these people? Well, again, I want to stress, while we're going to start here with some past tense, we could say, who are these people? And then here's some history. And I'm not going to use the word prehistory, which was common until pretty recently. When we talk about prior to the Spaniards arriving here in 1769, it used to be called prehistory. And now it's probably more commonly called pre-contact or pre-engagement, because prehistory was a concept having to do with did a given group of people have writing, or were they quote literate? And that's a little Eurocentric, and it really doesn't make any sense. So if you've not heard the word pre-contact, it means what was going on prior to about 1769. So, like many cultural groups, the Kumeyaay comprise of both the Ipai and Tipai, and there are some dialectical differences. And by that, I mean dialect, not in the Marxian sense of dialect, but some dialectical differences, probably some artifact differences, and some other cultural differences. But essentially, they were part of a group that we now call the Kumeyaay. Some Native Americans who are Kumeyaay don't like to be grouped under that rubric, by the way. They want to be known by their own clan name or their own family names, and they think Kumeyaay is a little too inclusive. But you can see here on this map that certainly their territory went way up towards the San Luis Rey River, and in fact, at one time, no doubt included the San Luis Rey River. And these are not firm boundaries. They're going to have changed over time, and also through intermarriage with other tribes, through shifting of the environment. It's a flexible system, but you get the general idea. And way down into Baja California, those of you that have traveled down to Baja California, as far south as Santo Tomas, you would still encounter people speaking the Kumeyaay language and having Kumeyaay culture. So one of the things that we're going to briefly touch on here is the fact that the Kumeyaay were not, absolutely not, simple hunters and gatherers. They had a very complex system of managing the environment. They did controlled burns, which, if we were doing today, we'd have a lot less of these terrible fires that we've been having. They occasionally diverted water where they needed it. They controlled erosion by laying down mats made out of fiber. So they were out there working within their environment, doing things that are not simple hunting and gathering. They were doing transplantation of plants, what we call proto-agriculture, bringing plants like elderberry and cactus and other plants that they need, including mesquite in some cases, as cuttings or seeds to their village and planting them. Amazing artist. This happens to be a boulder in Rancho Bernardo, and it's about 8 feet tall. And this was painted using natural dyes and pigments on a rock. And you can see it's very complex and fret designs. I know some of you saw Steve Frere's presentation on rock art during the last presentation. In fact, this Saturday, I believe it's this Saturday, the San Diego Rock Art Association is having their annual meeting, and it'll be a full day of rock art, some of which will certainly be from San Diego County. So you could go to the San Diego Rock Art Association website and register for that. It's a Zoom meeting. So a lot of rock art, a lot of vegetation manipulation and use. They had bipolar villages in many cases, the Kumeyaay, moving one in the summer, one in the winter, fished a great deal on the coast, went out in canoes as far as the Channel Islands and down to the Coronado Islands off of Baja California. So lots of expression of magic and art here in our landscape that you can visit in some cases. So I want to stress that we're not simple hunters and gatherers. So we hear about them eating rabbits and acorn and deer, but it kind of annoys me, and I know it annoys some Native American people, when you try to define a people by what they ate, because that's very, very limited. It would be, I would hope in the future that we are not today defined by McDonald's and fast food, even though we could be. But I think there's more to us than that, and there was certainly more, and there is more to the Kumeyaay than acorn gathering and hunting deer and a rabbit. And I would also mention there was a close correlation between the plants and the animals and the humans, because at one time around creation for the Kumeyaay, the animals talked and the animals were more human. They weren't mortal, but they were called people. They were considered to be human. And so hunting and gathering the plants that were put there by the creator is more than just gathering sustenance. It's something very, very quite unique. Those of you that go out and hike a lot, like my colleague Karen, who I saw was on here, you get to go out in the backcountry and smell that earth after a rain, or see the snow up on a mountain from a distance, or walk through the sage and brush up against it and get that beautiful smell from the sage. The Kumeyaay live this day to day. We go visit it, but it was part of their life then, and it's still part of their life today. Just very briefly, lots of sacred peaks all over the place here in San Diego County, because there's a whole series of stories and songs, literally hundreds of them, that at get-togethers are sung and said about in prayers. So this is Mount Woodson, looking at it in Ramona. Some of you probably hiked up to the top of it. This is from the east, looking west. And this gap right here, near where 67 comes through, this gap was actually made by a mythical creature by stepping on it, Tochapay, on his way to La Jolla, which, by the way, is not a Spanish word. It's a Kumeyaay word, Matlahoy or Matlahoy, meaning land of the rocks, or land of the holes in the rocks, or land with the holes, the coves out there in La Jolla. So this indentation, seen from afar, is tied directly to a story having to do right after creation, and when Tochapay was out there. And then the mountain itself is called Moon Mountain, because if you've ever been near Mount Woodson on a full moon night, these granodiorite boulders reflect the moon, and it just glows and lights up. Typically on a full moon night, you'll see a lot of hikers going up there for that reason. It's practically like daylight up there. And there are many peaks. Tecate Peak, Cuchma, is a sacred peak, Coles Mountain, Viejas Mountain, lots of sacredness to the land. And then things changed. So when the Spaniards got here, we're not going to deal with Cabrillo, but in 1769, when these strangers came, and that's the name of my book, Strangers in a Stolen Land, this area became known to the Spanish as Lafonterra, the frontier. There had already been Spanish down in Baja California, and obviously in Mexico, New Mexico, and Arizona. But when they arrived here in 1769, this area was called La Frontera. And you probably know extreme northern Baja California is still called La Frontera. It's a district, basically. So there's going to be a lot of changes when these Europeans come over. And so here's a little tidbit, factoids, if you will. You've got the Spaniards, and then later the Californios, meaning those people right before the Mexican Revolution and after the Mexican Revolution, who called themselves Californios. They broke away from the Spanish. And then lastly, the Americans. And these three new groups that came in were trying to establish themselves and trying to be more than a small colony. They were claiming this land. And even though Hispanic law and American law very specifically called for Indian land rights and freedom for the tribes, it was rarely enforced. It was rarely enacted. And the Indians, the Native Americans, the Kumeyaay in this case, are going to react in a lot of different ways. We're going to skim over that today. So one is accommodation. They traded with the people if it was to their advantage. In many cases, there was intermarriage. And I could give you a whole paper on that. One particular lady from the South Bay who married a soldier at the Presidio. So intermarriage. But there was also passive resistance, work slowdowns. So the Spaniards said, oh, these people are so lazy. They don't work well. They don't work fast. Well, part of that is they weren't used to working 8 and 10-hour days. The Kumeyaay didn't need to do that. They worked 5 or 6 hours and did quite well. But they also intentionally slowed down the work to irritate the Spanish and to not get as much done. That's a passive resistance. They avoided coming into the Presidio and the mission. There's sort of this image that all the Native Americans of San Diego County went to either Mission San Luis Rey or Mission San Diego. It's not true. Spanish only controlled a very narrow band along the coast, probably not much beyond Alpine going east, because after that it was very dangerous for them. So there was a lot of avoidance because a majority of the villages never got baptized, never had people coming into the mission system. And then very active resistance, which is primarily what we're going to talk about, murders of people that had wronged the Kumeyaay, revolt, and threats to kind of keep these people in their place, these Spanish. So secularization, which we're going to get to later on in 1835, brought a lot of changes as well. So you had the Spanish mission system. So let's kind of go through a couple myths there. The first mission in San Diego was actually on Presidio Hill. It was not a Mission Valley where this image is depicting. It was on Presidio Hill. That's where the first mission was. And then later, in 1774, it was moved up the valley to where it is today. Not this location, though. This particular building was built in 1805. But there was an original mission a little bit east of this, where the mission is today, a grassy area. And there were a lot of conflicts between soldiers and Native women. So if you study California history during this contact period, one of the things that I think is done quite incorrectly sometimes is people lump all the missions together and they lump all the Native American people together. And so they talk about Spanish missions and Native Americans. And you can't do that. There's 21 missions, and some of the missions had priests, fathers, missionaries, who were more humane than others. Some had priests that frankly were either pedophiles and or rapists. Some had missionaries who, within the context of what they were trying to do, missionizing the Indians, were at least benign and didn't have that type of sexual predatorship going on. The same way with the Presidios. But there were soldiers, and we're going to briefly talk about that, who did in fact here in San Diego County, soldiers, not because they were allowed to, but they were not often punished as they should have been, would go into the backcountry and rape Indian women, and in some cases gang rape them out near El Cajon, for instance. And we know their names, they're in the Spanish documents. And in some cases they were chastised or whipped for rapes. In other cases, they were simply restationed. They were sent to Monterrey or to Loreto, Baja California. So these conflicts between soldiers and Native women are obviously very traumatizing to the women, as well as their husbands, boyfriends, and sons and children, because this was not the Kumeyaay way. Sexual relations of that type, forced on them, coerced, was not done. And so when these Spaniards came in, this was very shocking to them. How many Spaniards? One could argue that back and forth, but there were certainly here in San Diego County over the years, 8 or 12, 8 or 15 sexual predators who took advantage of Indian women. Afterwards, some of the women hanged themselves. For instance, up near Sereno Valley, the village of Istawa, one young Kumeyaay woman, Ipai woman, hanged herself after being assaulted sexually. There were some children born of Spanish soldiers from the result of rape, and in some cases, those children were not allowed to live by the tribe. So it's a very traumatic time. And I always try to stress in my classes, we should take a harder look at the role of colonization and the Spanish coming to California, the effects of it on the women. We tend to focus too much, I think, on the men and on soldiers and battles and all of that stuff. But the effect on women was truly incredible. Indigenous dancing of this type was outlawed by the Spanish, by the missionaries, because they saw dancing as respecting of incorrect God. They saw it as, in some cases, they thought it was inappropriate, these kinds of dances and acting like an animal, as they called it, because in fact they are imitating animal calls and the moves of animals. If you've seen some dances amongst Native groups, sometimes they are doing a deer dance or a wolf dance or something. So these things were outlawed, and you would be punished for doing what was a very deep-seated practice in your own culture, having bird songs. They were not war dances, although one is called it's called a war dance, but it's not. It's simply a very aggressive form of dancing. So wherever the priests encountered this dancing, they tried to stop it. In the case of northern San Diego County, up where I am, there were actually a couple priests that instructed soldiers to go out with sledgehammers and picks and destroy Kumeyaay rock art, chisel it off the face of the rock. So how many beautiful images we may have lost in these 40, 50 years of Spanish colonization, it's hard to say, but certainly some. So this happens to be a sketch from Brazil. So I don't want you to leave thinking that this is directly San Diego County, but frankly, it could be because whipping was common. And one of the things I would stress about it is this was not given specifically to tribal members. It was not something dreamt up for tribal members. If you've studied European history, you know that whipping back in Europe and throughout the Americas was quite common, even though in this time period, we're going through the Enlightenment and there were laws passed not allowing you to whip more than 20 lashes a day, 20 azotes. You're not supposed to lash more than that. This particular implement this gentleman's using is illegal in California, but it was being used even though it was illegal. So this, you can imagine this being the Mission San Diego. They're off to the right, or the Presidio. And there's some palm trees in the back that got planted by the Spaniards. This could be the San Diego River. This could be a Mero Domo from the mission whipping a Kumeyaay man, rather than, in this case, a mixed blood, a person from Brazil. So this image actually would fit very well into San Diego. Who was allowed to whip? Well, the priests believed that they should be the only ones allowed to whip the Native Americans, not the soldiers, because they were afraid the soldiers would be too harsh, and they were. So the priests basically convinced the church and the viceroy that only they should administer whippings to, quote, their Indian children. On the other hand, if a Native American was perceived to break a law, a Spanish law against the crown, then in those cases, the commandant could have a soldier whipping Native American people. Some were virtually whipped to death. They were whipped until they were traumatized and had terrible cuts in their body. And then they were thrown in the Presidio jail there on Presidio Hill, and some died in the jail there. If you ever want a tour of that, I could give you a very good tour, I think, of the Presidio, and talk about what was really going on there in some cases and what Presidio Hill means. If you go there today, by the way, with the Sarah Museum on top of Presidio Hill, it's kind of a neat thing because you've got the Kumeyaay flag flying over the Presidio. I don't think they would have ever guessed that back in the day. So there was a first major revolt in 1774. There's some articles written about this. One of my colleagues, Steve Hackle, wrote a quite good book called Children of the Coyote, and it's the relationship between Native American people and Spaniards here in San Diego and throughout California. I did an article in the Journal of San Diego History some years ago, trying to clear up some myths about this mission revolt. So one of the things I would stress about it is, I believe that while there had been a lot of conversions and rapes and abuse of the Tipai, that is the Kumeyaay living south of the San Diego River, I think that the major reason for the revolt was religious. I think that the religious leaders, the Kumeyaay of the Kumeyaay people, wanted to kill Father Jaime. He was a demon. And that place of worship that we call the mission was a terrible place, both for the enslavement in some cases of Indians, of tribal people, but also because the Kumeyaay believed that a false religion was being taught to their people. So while certainly rapes and other things were an element of it, I believe it was largely a religious experience, very similar to the Pueblo revolts in New Mexico. So it took place on November 4th, which is tomorrow, right? Which is tomorrow. So November 4th, 1774. And I want to stress that it was not all of the Native Americans, all the Kumeyaay people, and in fact, it wasn't even all the villages, but certain villages that had very strong leaders, both military and religious, gathered together, 12 of them. My article has the names of those villages. I'll show you a map in a minute. And they sacked Mission San Diego around midnight on November 4th, 1774. They murdered Father Jaime, and they burnt the mission to the ground. Most of the mission at that time was not adobe. It was still brush, and they were making adobe blocks, but largely it was still a brush and wood structure. And ultimately, they took things from the mission, sacred objects, they destroyed some of them and kept others, the tribal members did. And ultimately, the suspected Quepai, that is the leaders of Kumeyaay, were brought in. Some turned themselves in, but they were brought in to the Presidio. They're on Presidio Hill. They were interrogated and beaten and ultimately released. None of them were killed as a result of this. And so here we can wade into some pretty thorny waters. But I want to stress that Father Serra, Serra, who we can look at many, many different ways, actually pleaded that these men not be killed, that they not be hanged, in fact, that they not even be exiled, that they should be shown Christianity, and that they should not be harmed any further than what they'd already been harmed by being whipped. And in fact, that happened to be the case. They were ultimately let go and went back to their villages. A couple of them were exiled and ultimately came back to San Diego. It's a whole very complex story, this revolt, of which people took part in it. So here's a map of San Diego County generally. And so Kumeyaay, which probably means the other place or something having to do with place, is where the mission was. This is the Presidio right above Kumeyaay, and so the village of Kumeyaay down there in Old Town. And these red dots represent the villages that took part in the sacking of the mission. How do we know this? Because we have the diary of the commandant, and from the archivos in Mexico City, I've retrieved all kinds of documents that very specifically name which villages took part in this. So you can see the pattern is generally south of the San Diego River. The furthest northeast village was Cuilemac, not Cuyamaca, but Cuilemac, which was basically Capitan Grande. And then further south, way down here, south of Tijuana, was Malejo, which is a few miles south of Tijuana in Baja California. And you can see where the rest of the villages are, but it's not everybody south of the San Diego River. Sequan apparently did not. A village that we call Las Choyas, which means the cactus, did not. Hamul apparently did not. So it was a matter in some cases of individual grievances, and in other cases, maybe your clan wasn't part of the clan that was involved in the sacking of the mission. But if you look, you see nothing north of the San Diego River, even though terrible things had happened to those people over here at Palmu, which is where Balboa hits Highway 5, where the old Pacific Beach Drive-In Theater used to be, or Onap, which is San Clemente Canyon. I know some of you've hiked through there, or Istawa, which is Sereno Valley. So terrible things had happened to these people, but they did not take part in the sacking. My theory is because of alliances. You had clan alliances between these other villages. So some of you might remember back in 1989, I had either the good fortune or the misfortune to do an archaeological excavation at Mission San Diego for a diocese hall that was going to be built and was subsequently built, but where it should have been built, not here. And one of the things that we noticed was in our archaeology, this is over 6 feet, it's 2 meters. So this pit is over 6 feet wide. And as we dug down through all this fill, we got 2 floors underneath the ground. So this floor is probably the 1778 mission building. And then we kept digging. We took the floor tiles out and kept digging, and underneath it was down here, way down here, was a burnt lens of soil. So what we think we found here is the 1774 church. So we went from up here, 1989, down to about 1778, and then down to 1774, 1775. And beneath this, by the way, was the village of Kumeyaay. It went down another 1.5 meters, and it was dated 2,000 years ago. Quite the cultural time periods going on here. So things kind of settled down a little bit after that. One could argue that the Kumeyaay got what they wanted. They killed Father Jaime and they burned the church to the ground. Some people say, well, why didn't they attack the Presidio? They had surrounded the Presidio and they had warriors around the Presidio. And if anyone would have come out of the gate of the Presidio, they would have been killed. And I think the Presidio would have been sacked. But because the guards were asleep, they didn't notice that the mission was on fire and that people were dying 6 miles to the east. So there was no alarm sounded. But I'm pretty sure they would have been wiped out. But the goal was not to kill the soldiers. And by the way, I think there were only 20-some soldiers on, in the mission for the Presidio that day. They would have been overwhelmed by these Tipai. Things settled down. And then Father Serra came back down from Monterey, rebuilt the mission. So now that's the second mission where the mission is today. And then later in 1805, the third mission was built. And that's the one that you go into today. Generally, it's been restored a great deal. But in 1778, and I won't read this to you, you can certainly read it for yourself, but a village called Palmu, which is up in Ramona, right by Mount Woodson, was allegedly going to come and attack the Presidio and the mission, another revolt. And so this converted Ipai, I want to stress this, there were native people who bought into it, who accommodated, who thought that maybe becoming Catholic, becoming Spanish was good. Some were forced and some were not. It looks like this fellow Benito from the village at San Diego, which by the way is near Del Mar, inland from Del Mar, between Del Mar and Rancho Santa Fe, that he pretty much accommodated and gone to what some people would say the dark side. He'd become a Catholic Spanish Indian native. So he informed the commandant of the Presidio, Benito, that the people of Palmu were going to possibly revolt. Why did he do this? Was this actually true or was it jealousy? We're not sure. So Spanish forces under Sergeant Carrico basically swept into Palmu right before sunset. Actually, that's you say sunrise, my apologies, before sunrise in April 1778. And when the people would not come out of the huts upon being demanded, they set fire to the huts. And some people no doubt burned to death within their huts. When people did come out, they were captured and they cut off the ears of some of the resistors and brought the ears back to the Presidio. They captured 4 Kumeyaay leaders, including this gentleman Elron, who was the leader of the village of Palmu in Ramona. They were put in jail, they were whipped, they were interrogated, and one young Kumeyaay died while in captivity and is actually buried at the Presidio. The others were beaten and ultimately released. This again is a case where Father Serra and Father Laswain convinced the viceroy in Mexico City to not execute these people. That was the order that was to be given. If you read Bancroft's Histories of California and a couple of other books, those books have it wrong. They say these 4 men were actually executed, and sometimes it's called California's first execution. They were not executed. One died in prison, and the other 3 were released because Father Serra and Laswain pleaded for them. So we can look at Father Serra for the destruction he brought with diseases and with Catholicism and destruction of Kumeyaay culture or Ohlone culture, any culture up and down the coast, if you will. But we can also sometimes peel that back a little further and say, yes, but there are examples here of where maybe he did the right thing. That is the humane thing, the Christian thing, the Christian thing. So to that degree, these 3 men who lived owe their life, ironically, to 2 Spanish missionaries who pleaded for their lives. And again, there's an article on this in the Journal of San Diego History that came out a couple of years ago. So let's move up to that little village called Palmu. This is what their huts would have looked like. The Kumeyaay have different styles of huts. One is this kind of linear hut made with tule and brush, and it's got a framework made out of cottonwood, and sometimes they're domed. So right now one is being constructed, huts are being constructed by Kumeyaay people up in the Cuyamaca Mountains. They're reconstructing a Kumeyaay village up there, and they're building the domed houses, if you will. And you'll see these at the Kumeyaay Ipai Tipai Cultural Center in Poway. They have built one of these, or 2 of these huts there too. So this is what Sergeant Carrico would have seen as he came into the village of Palmu. There's a pot sitting outside there in a basket. This happens to be from 1926 at Campo. It's a Edward Curtis photograph, actually. But this is the hut that would have been torched. So you can imagine people running out and then being knocked to the ground with clubs. This is the Rancheria de Palmu, and it today is part of the Ramona Grasslands project. So if you've ever hiked out there, it's over 2,000 acres of beautiful grasslands, and now it's linked up that you can actually hike down into San Pasqual Valley on the old stagecoach route that went down their county road. So these are mortars in the rocks. And to show you some good things that come out of some bad things sometimes. At one point, this was all slated for a golf course and 300 homes. And as it went through the county process, that map, between the biology and the botany and all kinds of other issues, and the fact that there were 40 archaeological sites recorded out here on that 640 acres, those 40 sites are actually the village of Palmu. Archaeologists have this really irritating thing, and I can say this as I'm a recovering archaeologist. We have a really irritating thing we've done over the years. We record sites and not culture sometimes. And so I ran this project, and at the end of it, we had 40 archaeological sites, all with their own little site numbers and their little sketch maps. But when you step back and you look at it through a bigger picture, you realize it's one village, and it's simply 40 different activity areas, cooking areas, living areas, burial areas, in this case, fruit processing areas on these borders. So I would highly encourage you, this is the old stagecoach road, by the way, down to San Pasqual Valley, to go hike this. If you're a hiker, go up there off of Highland Valley Road and hike the preserve. If you want to take the trail down to San Pasqual Valley, where there was also a huge Indian village, Kumeyaay village, you need a permit for that part because they're trying to reduce access on that trail. So this is the rancheria. Palmu was still out there. So going back to what I said 20 some minutes ago, this is a story that continues. The fact that those ears were cut off and these men were imprisoned and then finally got to go back to their village, the story continues because the descendants of these men and women at this village are still here. This village is still here. So let's move up to something closer to where I am. You might know, leaving Ramona and before you get to Julian, actually before you get to San Isabel, is a valley called Ballena Valley, Spanish for whale. And on some maps, it's called Whale Mountain. This mountain behind here, behind this barrel, is called a whale because it looks like a whale. Well, the Kumeyaay name for this is Ishpan, which means whale. So prior to contact, prior to the Spanish getting here, the Kumeyaay who lived here for thousands of years called this valley and that mountain behind it Ishpan, whale, Whale Valley, Whale Mountain. And then when the Spaniards got here, they asked the Kumeyaay, what do you call this? And they said Ishpan. They turned it into Ballena. Okay, we're going to call this Ballena Valley. So on early maps, it shows up as Ballena Valley. And then of course, when the Americans got here, they didn't want to speak Spanish or Kumeyaay. So they said, what do you call this? We're going to call it Whale Mountain. So the name of that mountain hasn't changed for thousands of years. It just became different languages. Ishpan, Ballena, Whale. So in 1808, right here in these rocks was a very large village in Ballena Valley, near the Camel Dairy, roughly. And there were 3 Kumeyaay men who were sheepherders. And they had agreed, you know, I don't think these 3 men were forced to do it. It was a way to feed their family and get some sheep, and both for clothing and also for food. And they were working out here under a guy named Amarodomo, a leader, like a labor leader, named Albanese. And they killed him one night. They came upon him. He was camped out there with them, and they beat him to death. And they shot him full of arrows. And then they threw him into this ravine. So this doesn't look like a ravine right now because there's been so much erosion and there's plants growing there, but it was deep enough that you could throw a body into it, which is what they did, and then throw rocks on top of it. And I think they thought they were going to get away with it, but somebody ratted them out, and they were arrested and brought down to the Presidio and put on trial. And at the trial, this is the beauty of Mexican-Spanish documents. At the trial, this map was sketched, and it's in the Archivos de Mexico down in Mexico City. And so I had an ex-graduate student go down there, actually she was already down there, and find all these documents. And we found the entire portfolio of this court case. So these 3 Native American Kumeyaay, Ipai, got a pretty good public defender, actually, a guy named Noriega, who later became the commandant of the Santa Barbara Presidio, and he pleaded their case. He said this man was he was bad. He was whipping them He was having sexual relations with one of the wives of one of these men, and they deservedly, to some degree, killed him. So what this map shows, if you don't read Spanish, is he was here between those boulders I just showed you. He was here camped out, asleep, and they came in. Two came from this side, and one came from this side, or was it two from this side? And they came in and they killed him. And then there's other maps that go along with this that show where they buried him, because they sketched where they buried him. And ultimately, the Spaniards came up to Ballena Valley and actually did a crime scene investigation and took the 3 suspects with them. So it was a really very complex story. An article on this that I wrote is about to come out in the journal called Bulletin, which is published by the California Mission Studies Association. So that article should come out, I think, in the next month or 2. So they were put on trial and they were found guilty. The commandant of the Presidio and the attorney for the Presidio, for the Spanish government, said that they should be executed, hanged. They should be hanged, and then their bodies should be dismembered, and then the parts buried in different places. That's what the verdict was. They were guilty, and that's what should happen to them. But Noriega, their attorney, pleaded to the viceroy, as well as the governor of California, and said, no, that's not right. They had cause, so they were found guilty with cause, that this was not premeditated exactly, and it certainly wasn't just because they chose to kill a Spanish person, a Spaniard, but because of the sexual relations, because of the abuse. This Alvarez kept beating them constantly, and so it was reduced to 10 years of labor at the San Diego Presidio. So this sounds, by today's standards, there are murderers, right, who get off with 20 years, 10 years to 20, and they usually get let go at about 10 years. So for this time period, this is actually a pretty lenient finding. So I don't want to suggest to you, certainly, that the Spanish system should have been treating Native Americans the way they did sometimes. But in this particular case, it's a lot better than execution and being dismembered. It's a lot better than hard labor, and they were not given hard labor. And also, they got to stay at the San Diego Presidio, and their wives would come up, according to documents, and feed them, and they would talk to them. Versus, in other cases, Native Americans who were sentenced to labor were sent somewhere else intentionally to take them away from their families, to break up their cultural bonds. It was not the case here. So I'm not apologizing for what happened on either side here, but my point is, in history, you need to keep looking at different instances and not do such broad brush strokes. It's one thing, it's academically lazy, and I think it produces a picture that's not good, not accurate. And then we've got the 1826 San Diego Revolt. So right down the road from where I am right now in Warner Springs. You might go by San Isabel, and you might go by Dudley's and pick up some bread there, or you might go to the pie shop next door and get yourself a little yummy blueberry pie. So at San Isabel in 1826, now we're in the Mexican period, right? We're in the Mexican period after the revolution. Several Ipai men killed Spanish soldiers. There were soldiers stationed at where the little mission at San Isabel is now, the Asistencia. There were Spanish soldiers there, and they had been putting their cattle and their horses out to graze on Ipai food, on native food, native seed crops. And there were some other things that the soldiers were doing. There was allegedly at least one rape. And so they killed some Spanish soldiers. The numbers in dispute. Bancroft's history says one thing, the Spanish documents of the time say something else, because some of the men died later, not immediately. But basically, probably 3 or 4 Spanish soldiers were killed, and the Ipai drove off the horses and probably captured and butchered the cattle. This one leader, Mayalapap, was captured, and 20 sets of Ipai ears, it says Tipai, but both Ipai and Tipai ears were taken to the Presidio as trophies. This was really common in this time period, sadly, was to cut the ears off of resistors or people who were not in good favor with the Spanish crown, and then take them to the Presidio. And you would show them, you would take them on the road and show them to other villages and say, this is what's going to happen to you if you resist. So this leader, very important leader, shows up in the records. He was Catholic. He had converted at Mission Santa Isabel. So he was convicted of murder. And in this case, he did not get off. And that's because he killed soldiers and also, by his own admission, was treasonous against the Spanish crown, in this case, the Mexican crown, the Mexican government. And he wanted to overthrow Mexico here in California at San Isabel. So for those reasons, he was executed by musket fire. We've got a good recordation of that. And then he's actually buried at the Presidio of San Diego. So without getting into the details of the more than 10 years that San Diego State excavated at the Presidio, some of the burials were Native American that were uncovered at the Presidio, on the Presidio Hill. One of them had musket balls in it, had 2 musket balls, one on the left side of the clavicle and one further down towards the rib cage. And I'm pretty sure it's him. I'm pretty sure it's him. So again, this story goes on because his descendants are still here in San Diego County. They still live up here at Mesa Grande and San Isabel. We know what clans he belonged to, and we know his families. You might know some of the names, the La Chapas, the Paipas. So this is the 1826 Santa Isabel Revolt. Within 20 years, San Diego County and all of California, Alta California, is going to become America, right? The Mexican-American War, 1846, the Battle of San Pasqual, which Native Americans played a role in, right? The people from Ponto, from the village of San Pasqual, helped Kearney, helped him bury his dead after that terrible battle down there, and then later helped dig them up and put them in carts and move them down to San Diego. One Native American from the village of San Pasqual, he was visiting there, actually Luiseno, ran down to San Diego to try to get help. He and Kit Carson ran down to San Diego. And the Native American got there about 8 hours before Carson. Carson got lost. He lost his shoes, you know, the great Pathfinder. Yeah. So now we're going to move into the late Mexican, early American period. So I put this quote up there because sometimes we talk about Juan Bendini and, you know, what used to be known as the Bendini House, now the Cosmopolitan Hotel. And we talk about Bendini, you know, as this Californio and part of our California history. And he indeed was. He had lots of children who went on to have a place in California history. But I point this out because this is a man who at his adobe, at the Bendini adobe, hired Kumeyaay, Ipai servants and worked with them. And yet when he was writing about them, this is what he had to say about them. So, you know, I don't need to read this to you or point out how virtually none of these things are true, but this was his perception of them. And he used this, as did other Californios, to justify enslaving them or making servants out of them. And even if they were paid very, very little. So in my book, Strangers in the Stolen Land, I get into this a little bit, that from early days of the mission, right up through the American period till about 1900, Kumeyaay and Luiseno and Cupeño were the major labor force in San Diego County. There was not a big Chinese labor force. There certainly was not a big non-Native American white, if you will, labor force. They built a lot of San Diego, including the Hotel del Coronado and the railroad, and lots of structures and dams and things around San Diego County. So I show you this not to pick on Juan Bendini. He's not an exception, sadly. He's probably represents a lot of Californios. And then of course, over the years, many of these California families intermarried with Kumeyaay. And that dilution, if you will, of ethnicity changed over time. So by the time we get to the 1870s and 80s, you might recognize this. This is Florida Canyon, right below Morley Field on the right, and Navy Hospital is right on top of these hills. This is where the Navy Hospital is today. So this is Pershing, that area, and one of the last rancherias villages in San Diego County was there until they were driven out. And so this is how they're living. So they're living basically with canvas and cloth strung over a structure. So the superstructure is very similar to how they had lived all those other years, but now they're living in squalor, basically. These gentlemen here, if you enlarge this, are actually playing a game called peon, probably. You've got the women in various European dress, but also some native dress. They've gone out and scavenged and brought in barrels. So you could look at this one of two ways. You can look at it many ways, but one would be that they're living in a squalor, they're not doing well. But I would look at it also that they're persevering right there on the outskirts of town. They're persevering, even though all these laws are being passed against them, that they can't own a gun. They can't testify against a white in a courtroom situation unless a white wants them to. They can't go to white schools. They can't go to law school and try to defend themselves. But while all that's going on, and no alcohol and a lot of other things, they're persevering and they're trying to keep their language. And like all of us as parents, trying to keep their kids safe for that next generation. So we could look at this photo as we can lots of photos in different ways. And by the way, part of this was excavated sort of accidentally when they were repairing the road and the flood system down here below Navy Hospital, and remnants of this village were found, artifacts that were from the American period, but they were clearly Native American. So I've got, I don't know, a few more slides, but not very many, because we want to wind this up if you have any questions. So earlier I showed you some dancers and talked about how it was prohibited by the Spanish. Today, dancing, singing, telling stories, talking about creation is a very alive and vibrant part of Kumeyaay culture. There are different bird singers. And why are they called bird singers? Well, according to Paul Quero and some others, it's because birds originally taught them some of these songs, and birds are messengers. Some songs are derived from dreams. Some are family traditions. There's songs that go back in a given family. Families have their own songs. So I point this out because if you go to a gathering or a powwow or where bird singers are, you may hear different songs at different places. If you're trying to learn Kumeyaay, and you hear some Kumeyaay songs, you might also hear some words you don't understand. Well, it's because they're Mojave, in some cases Luiseño. The Kumeyaay brought in different cultures and different songs, different stories. If they liked them, they incorporated them, or they incorporated parts of them. So this is Raul Chrisman here in the middle, and his dad, Ron, and his dad, Ron, and a couple of other people, Hank Murphy, Leroy Elliott, bless his heart, knew these old bird songs going back thousands of years, and they transmitted them on to Raul Chrisman and other bird singers, Quero, other folks. And luckily, we also have wax cylinder recordings from the 1890s and early 1900s of these bird songs. So now the Kumeyaay are getting to hear bird songs that had been sung by their great-great-grandparents, and with different dialects. Really fascinating. This happens to be up at the Chrisman's house, and I would do some video work up there with them. So they persevered. These folks persevered. One way they made money was by throwing fiestas, and they'd always had fiestas amongst the tribes, which was a way to share things and honor different people. Also, in terms of courtship, maybe bring in some men and women, young men and women from other villages, and the courtship. By this time period, 1930, there's all kinds of stuff going on. So I want you to think about pre-air conditioned San Diego, and you're living down in downtown San Diego, and the drinking water is crappy, and you don't have air conditioning, and it's August and it's hot. So you get in your horse, or you get in your car if you've got one, or your wagon, and you go up here to what's now El Capitan Reservoir. But at that time, it was a village. It was the village of El Capitan Grande. And you go up there and you camp out, and it's free. And you watch some dances. It says Indian war dances, because of course you got to attract the white people by putting war dances in there, not just dances, peon games, lots of other stuff going on. And then you could buy refreshments and meals, but the camping was free, and you got fresh water, something you didn't get in San Diego. So those of you that might know our local communities today, the Cordero family still very involved. The Mezas, for instance, had Hamur, and the Prietos are still, and the Benegases. They also played baseball games. Sadly for these people at Capitan Grande, this is 1930, By 1935, they'll be moved out and their valley will be flooded. And if you live in North Park, that's where your water comes from. It comes from Capitan Grande Reservoir there. So you can go out there today and you get a canoe and you can go out in the middle of Capitan Grande or El Capitan Reservoir. And if you look down about 90 feet into the water, the village of Capitan Grande is underneath you, underneath the water. Very briefly here, we'll do reservations. So what's a reservation? I put this in here because there seems to be a lot of misconceptions about this. One, it's actually federal land that's set aside for the tribes. And it's not unique. We have military reservations, we have national parks, but I want to stress that it's federal, and therefore, in general, state law does not apply unless that reservation and the federal government allow the state to play a role. This goes back, by the way, to the Articles of Confederation. Indian nations are sovereign under the Articles of Confederation. So when people say, well, isn't Indian gaming just kind of, like white man's guilt to make up for the terrible things that happen, we're going to let them game? No, it's because they're sovereign. It's because they get to choose on their reservation their way of life and how they want to go about some things. And I'm not going to go into the whole gaming issue because it's extremely complex, but the basis for it is, since gaming is not against federal law, it can be practiced on reservations. And then you get into compacts and agreements individual tribes have made with states. But I want to stress that these reservations are not something new. They go back to George Washington. They go back to the very Articles of Confederation. Does the state have authority on reservations? The answer is yes and no. Originally, no. Over the years, some has been taken away from the tribes and given to states. And in some other cases, some reservations have entered into compacts with the state to allow the state to have certain authority on these reservations. So here's a map you might not have thought about in my last couple of minutes here. San Diego County, here's your takeaway of the day. San Diego County has the most reservations of any county in the United States. Not the largest, for sure. You could take all the reservations in Riverside and San Diego County, drop them into the Navajo reservation, and they would disappear. We have very small ones like Hamul down here, the Hamul village, which is less than 8 acres. And then you have Los Coyotes, which I look out my window, I can see, because I live about right there. Los Coyotes is 22,000 acres. So very, very large, very small reservations. So you know some of these, right? Capitan Grande, there is still a reservation called Capitan Grande, even though there's a lake covering 2/3 of it, but it's still a reservation. You might know Verona, certainly, Viejas, Inyaha. I doubt if most of you know that, but it's still out there. Kajmit, and you see the others on here. And this is the old spelling that Europeans put for Weapai. So it was Kuyapai, but it's Weapai. And then when we get north up here, north of San Pasqual, these are Luiseno reservations. So we have 19. We have 19 reservations, the most of any county. And we're going to end up here on civil rights. So this has been a battle from day one between the tribes and the federal government, tribes and cities, tribes and counties, but they do come under the federal government, and their rights, whatever that right might be, precedes states' rights, because the states were formed later, and yet they are also covered under the Constitution. Tribes are, because they are within the boundaries of the United States. I'm sure you know this without giving you a civics lesson. You don't have to be a citizen to be covered by the Constitution. You simply have to be in the United States. And their sovereignty, meaning their ability to declare themselves as nations, that's what we called them originally when we made treaties with them back in the 1700s. We called them the Iroquois Nation or the Cherokee Nation. And then over the years, the US Supreme Court has continually found for Native Americans, for their rights, for their sovereignty. And here's the last 3 slides, I do believe. So I want to end this on a reasonably happy note, in that one of the reasons I can give you this lecture and that I know something about what I know here is because the Native Americans are very much a presence in this county, as you probably increasingly know. So if you've lived here long enough, maybe you had grandparents who used to take turkeys up to a reservation at Thanksgiving, and now you've got tribes that at Thanksgiving give hundreds of thousands of dollars to Father Joe or to the food bank to try to help people off reservation, non-Indian people, I might add. And so what a turn of events in 50 or 60 years, right? So I show you this poster because we're very proud at San Diego State that we do sponsor powwows, and that we've got our own Native American Student Alliance. And we acknowledge on campus that we are sitting on Kumeyaay land, and on and on and on. So the people have persisted. So these are some ancient eagle dancers up at at Mesa Grande. This, if you want to go exactly where this is today, get in that canoe at El Capitan Reservoir, go out to the middle and look 80-some feet down. That's where this lady was sitting. This is the cover of my book. The little girl's got her chicken with her, and here's a mortar and a pestle. So this village is still underwater, and some of it's out of the water because the lake is down now, right? Here's just your takeaway. Finally, the population was probably about 20,000 when the Spaniards got there. It's back up to that. Indian health is greatly improved. Like all communities, they were dealing with some drug and alcohol problems. Languages are being revitalized. Some of my friends I see that are watching this today are very involved in that. Culture, lands being purchased by tribes, being added either to their reservation, and the Indians were telling their own story. So there's Saquon. So this happens to be Capitan Grande, the reservoir. It's my last slide. And do you see the face up here in the clouds? Some people think that this was the ancient leader of the village, Cuitlamac, at Capitan Grande. And the day that I took this particular photograph, he was out overlooking the valley. So there you have it. So now you know everything I know about this during this time period. There's lots of articles. Diana mentioned that yes, you know, over the years I've written a lot, but what I want to stress is increasingly Native Americans like Mike Connolly and others are writing Kumeyaay history that is being taught now at Kumeyaay College, and it's a very vibrant ongoing process. So there you have it. Diana, back to you.
Hey, Richard, that was absolutely outstanding. And what tremendous research you have done over the years. Very, very impressive. So again, before we go into the chat to see what questions there are, want to remind everybody that, you know, Richard's book, Strangers in the Stolen Land, is available from Sunbelt at a discount. Just check our website. And then also, let's see, let's take a look at some of these questions.
While she's looking, I'll address one that I did see. That is the hiking area that I was talking about for the Ramona Grasslands project. You basically, I don't know where you live, but if you were coming up from downtown, down San Diego, coming up to Ramona, at the first stoplight before you get into Ramona, that's Highland Valley Road, and you take it left to the north, and then you go to the first major curve and you make a left, and you'll see a little kiosk and a sign, and it says Ramona Grasslands. You pull in there and you park. It's called the Ramona Grasslands Preserve. You can Google it, and you're allowed to hike about 2,000 acres. You can ride horses. A lot of people do. And you can ride a mountain bike, not a motorized mountain bike, but a bicycle bike. And then if you want to actually hike all the way down to San Pasqual Valley, you have to go online and get a permit because they restrict the amount of people on that particular trail. It's a beautiful, and it changes all the time. After a little bit of rain, you got a lot of grass. You'll see hawks out there. The hawk watch people go out there and do hawk watches. If you're a birder, amazing birds. There's some springs out there that the ducks come to. Beautiful area, beautiful area.
Okay, and a question for you. What's the history of the checkerboard of land like San Pasqual or Torres Martinez?
Torres Martinez and those others, that originally was one large piece of land that was set aside forever, right, for the Native Americans. But then when the trains were coming through, down from Los Angeles and down from San Francisco, the US government promised the train companies, the railroads, land. And so what they did is they gave every other square mile of those reservations to the railroads so that they could sell them off and make money, and also so they could build train stops, because these are steam engines, and have water and wood for the boilers on the trains. And so certain reservations throughout America, if a train came through, they gave away every other square mile. That's why it looks all checkerboard. The good news is for the people, the Kumeyaay people, is they still own almost a third of Palm Springs. And they rent it and lease it out. So when you go to Palm Springs and You go to those, elaborate places down there and you spend all that money and you go to those restaurants. Some part of that money is going back to the tribe, back to the Kumeyaay.
So a question, I'm curious about upcoming cultural events or more hiking suggestions.
Ooh, well, hiking suggestions, you should buy Diana's book on Anza Borrego Desert, because this is the time to go out in the desert, starting now. I mean, starting a couple of weeks ago, but amazingly beautiful. And she gives you lots of good trails and hikes out there. There's a great book by a colleague of mine, A Foot and a Field in San Diego, Foot and a Field in San Diego. And he mentions trails that oftentimes have Native American sites on them that are not fragile. That is, you can hike through them. Upcoming events, we're just winding down from powwow season because it typically is during the summer. And of course, there was the whole COVID thing. But if you go to Google or to a website and any of the tribes' websites locally, the reservations, they'll tell you what's upcoming. But there is actually a couple of websites devoted to powwows in California, because some of the other tribes, I think the Quitsan out on the Colorado River by Yuma, are having a big get together in the very near future. So actually, Google and the internet can be your friend, and you can go find out about all these amazing things. It's constantly going on. We just had the big one in Balboa Park. November was October, November overlap Native American Heritage Month. So there's a lot of stuff going on. But yeah.
One last question. Have the genetics of San Diego's Native Americans been studied to determine their origin?
That's a controversial topic, and I would probably prefer our Native American to answer that. But in general, yes. In general, yes, but only so far back. And the basic answer is the Kumeyaay language, for instance, the human Hokan language, is one of the oldest languages in the United States. And we can only trace it back about 5,000 to 7,000 years, because that's how language works. But it clearly goes back well beyond that. Genetically, they are closely related to people way down in Baja California. Some people think that the Kumeyaay may have the creator. Let's take that. The creator may have put them in Baja California and they moved up. Other people believe that they were more towards the islands and more towards Orange and Los Angeles County. Others think out in the Colorado desert. So archaeologists might look at this one way, linguists another, but genetically they are related to what we call the human stock of people, which is a very ancient DNA. And I'm not going to go get into the land bridge and taking DNA back to Europe, because that's a whole other study. And frankly, one of the B's that I got in college, a B grade, was in physical anthropology. So I'm not qualified to talk about DNA beyond that. Hi, Tom. How are you?
Richard, that's great. And, just a quick thing for the viewers there, you had mentioned the San Diego Rock Art Festival this weekend. Just so everyone knows, on Sunbelt, we are discounting 20% all the rock art books as part of the festival this weekend. So anyone interested in that should check our website for that also. And again, Strangers in a Stolen Land is available from us at a discount. Please check the website. And Richard, thank you so much for this most excellent presentation, so informative. And those who are viewing, be sure to tell others to come back in a couple of days and view the recording. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you.